Alright, let's talk about what's got the Bond fandom buzzing. Rumors swirling around Bond 26, from potential casting choices to the big-name directors Amazon might be bringing in, an emphasis on might. Yes, I've seen the headlines. Rumor has it that Pierre might be taking on the iconic role of 007. And if that name doesn't ring a bell right away, don't worry, you're not alone. Most people are going to recognize him soon enough as the new Green Lantern in James Gunn's upcoming DCU. But here's the thing. While everyone's getting excited about who might play Bond or who might direct the next film, nobody's really talking about the narrative disaster zone that Bond 26 is walking into. Because, spoiler alert, if you somehow miss No Time to Die, James Bond is dead. Not figuratively, not emotionally, not left ambiguous with a wink. He died. Missile strike to the face. Goner. So, now what? You just swap actors, bring in a slick new director, and pretend it never happened? That's the problem. Nobody's asking the real question. How do you make a new Bond film when the last one blew him up? Literally. And if you're someone who likes to stick around until the final frame, I've tucked in a little nod near the end. Just something for the true believers. Let's back up. The Daniel Craig era tried really hard to be the thinking man's Bond, but it didn't feel like Bond. It felt like an apology for Bond. And a lot of that came down to Daniel Craig himself. This is the same actor who, after Spectre, famously said he'd rather slit his wrists than play Bond again. That wasn't just a flippant remark. He meant it. And yet, he came back for No Time to Die, but only under the condition that Bond would die at the end. That was Craig's idea. He pushed for it, and the producers gave him the keys to the kingdom. No other Bond actor had that kind of narrative control. Sean Connery didn't, Roger Moore didn't, Timothy Dalton didn't, and no one blames Pierce Brosnan for how Die Another Day turned out. That movie was a product of its time. Over the top, ridiculous, and honestly, I liked it. It felt like You Only Live Twice, a wild, escapist adventure with gadgets, villains, and spectacle. That's what Bond used to be. That's what made it fun. But Craig's Bond? He was the anti-Bond. Brooding, broken, constantly questioning his place in the world, and while that might have worked for one film, it became the entire identity of the franchise for 15 years. That's not evolution, that's erosion. Take gadgets, for example. Classic Bond had exploding pens, wristwatch lasers, cigarette guns, ski pole rifles, all kinds of fun. GoldenEye gave us that iconic pen that could blow a room sky high. You Only Live Twice had bullets hidden in the cigarettes. And my personal favorite, even if it never left Q Branch, the hookah machine gun from The Spy Who Loved Me. The Craig era? A tiny radio in Skyfall, a fingerprint scanner, yawn. It was all stripped down, barely their tech, and it robbed the character of one of his coolest trademarks. And what about the Bond girls? Yes, I called them Bond girls. I'm not apologizing for it, because that's what they are. That term has defined the role these women have played in the franchise. Seductive, dangerous, complex, sometimes allies, sometimes adversaries, and always integral to the story. Let's not forget that the women in Bond films weren't just eye candy. They were often narrative weapons. And The Spy Who Loved Me, the film opens with Bond in a ski cabin with a woman who, it turns out, is spying on him for the Russians. Later, during his escape sequence, Bond unknowingly kills a Soviet agent who, as it turns out, was the lover of Russian agent Anya Amasova, also known as Agent XXX, who he later teams up with. When Bond and Anya are later forced to team up for a joint mission, she discovers it was Bond who killed her lover and promises to kill him when the mission is complete. That's tension, that's layered conflict, and that's Bond. Caroline Munro also shows up in that film as a deadly henchwoman working for the villain Karl Stromberg, further proving how often women were woven into the narrative not just as companions, but as threats. And this wasn't some one-off thing. It's baked into Bond's DNA. Throughout the franchise, women have been used against him precisely because they're his greatest weakness, aside from vodka martinis, obviously. Take Sophie Marceau's Electra King from The World Is Not Enough, arguably one of the most layered femme fatales in the franchise, even if the movie itself wasn't great. She seduces Bond, manipulates him, and becomes one of the few who nearly breaks him. Or Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin in Tomorrow Never Dies, not a seductress, but an equal, a Chinese agent working her own angles. They start off at odds, crossing paths and goals, and only later align. They weren't just quote-unquote love interests. They were Bond girls in the truest sense. Icons who shaped his missions, tested his instincts, and left a lasting mark on his journey. That dynamic? It's essential to the Bond formula, and it's been largely absent from the Craig era. And speaking of questionable character treatment, let's talk about what Skyfall did to Moneypenny. Yes, they reimagined Moneypenny as a black woman in Skyfall, but that casting choice isn't my issue. It's what they did with the character afterward that bothers me. They made her a field agent. Okay, cool, bold choice. Then she quote-unquote kills Bond during the opening mission, gets pulled from field duty, and becomes a secretary. So, we reinvent the character just to have her fail and get demoted. If the original Moneypenny was a one-note character, just M's secretary with a crush on Bond, this version was arguably worse. They tried to build her up only to push her back into the same limited role. That's not progress. That's a narrative cul-de-sac. Then there's Spectre, the iconic evil organization from the Connery days. Back then, they had clear motives. They were trying to spark World War III, pit global superpowers against each other, profit from the chaos. You knew what they were about. Craig's Spectre? What was their goal? Vague mentions of data leaks, revenge plots, global influence, but nothing coherent. They turned Blofeld into Bond's long-lost brother in Spectre, which felt like a desperate attempt to force emotional stakes. Again, it all points back to this modern trend where everything has to be interlinked. Everything needs a twist rooted in childhood trauma. Why? The Bond of old thrived on episodic missions. Each film was a fresh assignment. Sean Connery wasn't checking in on events from Dr. No and Thunderball. Pierce Brosnan wasn't having existential crisis about GoldenEye while surfing a glacier and die another day. Bond used to have the freedom to start fresh. The Craig era killed that freedom and then killed Bond himself. Let's also not forget, Daniel Craig never got his own Bond car. He drove around the same 1964 Aston Martin made famous by Connery in Goldfinger and Thunderball. That car belongs to the 60s, to a Bond era defined by suave and showmanship. The Craig era was supposedly modern day, but they kept dragging that car back in as a symbol instead of giving Craig his own automotive identity. That's not homage, that's brand stagnation. Now we're hearing about Amazon's director's shortlist. Denis Villeneuve, Edgar Wright, Paul Greengrass, big names with distinct visions, and yeah, they're brilliant. Villeneuve gave us Dune, Wright made Baby Driver, Greengrass redefined action pacing with The Bourne Ultimatum. But here's the danger. These aren't just directors, they're auteurs. Directors with style, with muscle, with awards. And when you hire directors like that, who's going to tell them the word no? Nobody stopped Martin Campbell, and we got Casino Royale, which many people praise, but let's be honest, it traded the Bond formula for Bourne's. Not saying no to Sam Mendes, and we got Skyfall, a movie that began with Bond being washed up and ended with him emotionally shattered. Mendes won an Oscar for American Beauty and directed Road to Perdition, which ironically starred Daniel Craig. Again, who's pushing back when these guys say they want to reinvent the wheel? That's my fear with this new shortlist. These directors are going to make their Bond film, not a Bond film. No one rooted in the franchise's long, weird, wonderful history, but something that aligns with their personal vision, even if that vision doesn't fit the DNA of 007. So let's summarize. We've got a dead James Bond, a rumored new 007 that most audiences only know from upcoming DC projects, a creative team that still hasn't answered for the narrative dead end left by No Time to Die, a run of films that turned gadgets into glorified Bluetooth devices, that scrapped Bond girls, that mishandled legacy characters, and that twisted iconic villains into soap opera drama. And now Amazon is sitting on this IP wondering what to do next. Here's my advice. Don't rush it. Don't throw a new actor and a high-powered director at the screen just to keep the machine moving. Fix the foundation first. Figure out what James Bond is in 2025. Reinvent if you must. But don't pretend the last 5 films didn't bury the core of what made Bond great. I'm not asking for a repeat of the old days. I'm asking for a reset that remembers what made Bond Bond. A confident loner with style, wit, charm, and just enough danger to make you wonder what side of the line he's standing on. A man with gadgets, missions, escapes, and villains you love to hate, not ones who used to share bunk beds with him. Whoever comes next, and whoever directs it, needs to stop making Bond quote-unquote relatable and start making him legendary again. So, let's get the conversation going. Do you think Bond 26 can recover from No Time to Die? Does the rumored casting of Aaron Pierre interest you or worry you? What kind of story do you want to see next? Let me know your take in the comments and let's unpack it together. And hey, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, here's your code word. Kingsley Amos. A nod to the first continuation Bond author after the death of Ian Fleming. Drop that in the comments so I know you're one of the real ones who stuck through the full intel briefing. And if you want more genre talk with a wild twist, click over to my video about AI writing its own martial arts film. It's a crazy breakdown you don't want to miss. I'll link it right here on screen.